Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to the channel. We have some breaking news. The main event of UFC 281 will be Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira for the middleweight title. And I'm going to get to my early prediction in a little bit, but this is a fight that was one of my most anticipated fights of 2022. It was one of the fights that the UFC just had to make. And this is one of the biggest middleweight title fights of all time. I have not been this excited for a middleweight title fight since probably UFC 168. This was when Anderson Silva was going to rematch Chris Weidman. Obviously, it ended up terrible. Silva broke his leg. But that's the last time I've been this excited for a middleweight title fight. And the last time before that was probably Anderson Silva versus Chael Sonnen 2. I was super hyped for that matchup. I have not been this excited up until Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira. And since both of their performances at UFC 276 in July, we knew this was the next fight to make. And I am so glad the UFC booked this, and it's only right around the corner, November 12th. And I even mentioned this in a video I made about Dustin Poirier versus Michael Chandler, which supposedly is going to take place on the same card at UFC 281. I mentioned that I thought the main event of this card would be Adesanya versus Pereira. But before I get into any of the reasons why this fight's amazing and get into my early prediction, shout out to Israel Adesanya. I know there's a lot of Adesanya slander going around recently. Some of it I agree with, some of it I don't. But he is super active. He's one of the most active champions. I mean, this will be his attempt at a third title defense in 2022. It just seems like champions just aren't that active anymore. Maybe once or twice a year. You have Adesanya, who's been staying active. You know, he just fought in July, and now he's going to fight in November. A lot of other guys, they fight in July. You're like, okay, well, we're not going to see them till February or March. And on top of that, Adesanya is never looking to kind of, make his way towards an easy fight. He's always fighting the best competition available to him. He took the belt off of Robert Whittaker. And then it was looking like it was going to be Paulo Costa next, but Paulo Costa had a bicep injury. And the UFC wanted Adesanya to wait for Costa, and Adesanya said, no, I'll take Yoel Romero, even though he just lost to Paulo Costa, which was actually a close decision that could have went to Yoel Romero. And who's calling out Yoel Romero? Yoel Romero, I believe, is one of the best UFC fighters of all time to never hold a title. And I get it. The performance against Yoel Romero was garbage. But at the end of the day, that doesn't disprove my point. Adesanya is constantly facing the toughest competition available to him. He then goes on to fight Paulo Costa, and he absolutely destroys Paulo Costa, chewed up the legs, chewed up the body, and then TKO'd him. And this was a fight that a lot of people were picking Paulo Costa, myself included. I thought Paulo Costa was going to be too big, too strong. He was going to put the pressure on him. Adesanya outclassed him in every aspect. Costa could not even find Adesanya in this fight. And then Adesanya goes, you know what? Well, after that, I'd like to move up and challenge Jan Blachowicz, who I believe beat Dominic Reyes for the light heavyweight belt on the same card. Adesanya said, you know what? I want that guy. He moves up. He fights Jan Blachowicz. It doesn't go his way, but still, he's facing the toughest competition. And then even after he loses that fight, I think he lost that fight in March, he makes a quick turnaround in June and fights Marvin Vettori. I think that was at UFC 263. Marvin Vettori, top 5 middleweight. And this is not an easy matchup. He beats Marvin Vettori. I get the performance is not that great. And then he fights Robert Whittaker in February this year at UFC 271. Then he fights Jared Cannonier, at UFC 276. He wins that by decision. And now he's fighting in November against Alex Pereira, which this is just an amazing matchup because not only do you have two elite world-class fighters, you have an amazing backstory. You have the fact that in kickboxing, Alex Pereira has 2 wins over Israel Adesanya, which is just an amazing backstory. I hate these fights where there's manufactured drama. There's this manufactured story to try to sell pay-per-views, try to sell tickets. You don't need it for this fight. You have 2 world-class guys. They're fighting for a title, and you have this amazing backstory. And I know Adesanya, people have been saying, well, these performances have been terrible. I particularly didn't enjoy the last few performances, especially the Cannonier fight. Wasn't particularly enjoyable. And a lot of people say, well, the middleweight division is trash. And I honestly don't believe that. I think when you have a champion that is so tough to figure out in his skill set, like Israel Adesanya, it just makes the division look worse than it actually is because you look at the fighters and you're saying, okay, well, he's not beating Adesanya. He's not beating Adesanya. He's not beating Adesanya. At this point, Adesanya has effectively cleaned out the division. There's no one left for him to fight. He's beat Whitaker twice. He's beaten Vettori twice. He's beaten Paulo Costa, and Paulo Costa hasn't had a win since. Who else is there for him to fight? There's really nobody there for him to fight because he's cleaned out the division. And I know there's a couple young guys making their way up, like Nasruddin Imavov and Andre Muniz, but they're not quite there yet. And the UFC signed Alex Pereira. They knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted to fast track him to a middleweight title fight, and everything is working out. And how crazy is it? Alex Pereira is going from making his UFC debut at UFC 268 in November of 2021 to 1 year later main eventing, a UFC 281 card against Adesanya fighting for a title. That's an insane story in itself. And I get the UFC fast-tracked him because I believe Alex Pereira, he couldn't have been one of those guys that won 6 or 7 fights, made his way up the ladder, and got a title shot. Because I honestly believe, you look at some of those matchups in the middleweight division, he's probably not going to win. I think he has a tough time beating guys like Marvin Vettori or Robert Whitaker. His debut was against Andreas Michailidis. He won by flying knee KO. What does that win really mean? It doesn't mean much. Then he goes on to take a slight step up in competition. He beats Bruno Silva by decision. And then you're like, okay, well, he's beat 2 decent guys who aren't even in the top 15. Who is the UFC going to match him up with next? And the UFC took a look at the top 10 and they said, you know what? Who do we have the best probability of getting Pereira a win against so we can justify a title shot? And they landed on Sean Strickland, which I believe was the right pick. You have a guy in Sean Strickland who is a top 5 ranked guy in the middleweight division, but he's primarily a striker. People say, oh, his grappling's great, his wrestling's great, but he doesn't really ever use it at the highest level. So the UFC saw Sean Strickland and they're like, okay, Pereira could go out and beat Sean Strickland, and then we can easily justify giving him a middleweight title shot. And that's exactly what he did at UFC 276. He went out there and brutally KO'd Sean Strickland in the first round, and now he's earned himself a title shot. It's very rare immediately after an event, which I'm talking about UFC 276, the main event. Adesanya defeated Jarrett Cannonier by decision, and in the feature fight on the main card, we had Pereira brutally KOing Sean Strickland, and we knew what was next. There's no one left for Israel Adesanya to defend his belt against. And this is just, I love that all these puzzle pieces are falling into place. And I know Adesanya's had a couple boring fights. The last time he had an exciting fight, I don't even know when it was at this point, because he's had a lot of boring performances. But he's just a guy that's really tough to figure out. And he will stay at range. He will chop your legs. He'll pump the jab out there. And he's really hard to track down. Well, now he's got the toughest test of his career in a guy that has flatline KO'd him in Alex Pereira. Alex Pereira has 2 wins over him in kickboxing. One, he won by decision, which I haven't seen the entire fight, but apparently it's questionable. And then the second one, there's no debate in that one. He flatline KO'd Israel Adesanya. And I know this was 4 or 5 years ago, something along those lines, but still, this is an amazing story. And this has got to still be in the back of Israel Adesanya's mind. And I'm wondering, coming into this fight, is Israel Adesanya going to be so motivated? Is he going to want to get that finish back? Adesanya's been talking a lot, and I think that's what's kind of got him a bad rap in the past few fights. He's like, oh, I'm coming to show off in this fight. I'm going to finish him. And then he leg kicks and jabs to another decision, and people are like, well, what were you talking about before the fight? In this fight, we might see more motivated Adesanya than we have ever seen. And I know there's been MMA memes at this point, motivated Conor McGregor, motivated BJ Penn, but Adesanya could come in more motivated than ever, wanting to get his revenge against Alex Pereira. And again, those wins for Alex Pereira were 5-6 years ago. And I believe both fighters have drastically improved since then. Israel Adesanya is not the same fighter he was back then. And Alex Pereira, same thing, is not the same fighter he was back then. So I'm really interested in this fight because you have a guy in Adesanya who's very hard to figure out. But now you have a guy in Alex Pereira who has around the same reach as Israel Adesanya. He has the same level of credentials as far as elite level striking. And I'm curious, is Alex Pereira going to play that game with Israel Adesanya? I believe Pereira can force Israel Adesanya into some uncomfortable situations. If Adesanya wants to hang back and try to strike, I think Pereira can hang back and try to strike as well. And maybe at some point, Adesanya could be down on the scorecards and Adesanya may be forced to be more aggressive. Because that's one thing I can't stand about Adesanya. I understand his game plan. But when he has these boring fights, and he faces criticisms, he often reflects those to his opponent. Well, they're not trying to attack me. He says they're not trying to attack me so I can counter-strike them. Well, it's on you as well. You weren't trying to attack them. You just want to wait. It's not only on your opponent to attack you. You got to make something happen as well. And I know you can say that about both fighters, but Alex Pereira can be that guy. Alex Pereira may be slamming some leg kicks of his own, pumping his jab. He may be winning rounds, and Adesanya may be forced to be aggressive. And also you have the fact that Alex Pereira has that nuclear power in his hands. Look what he did to Sean Strickland, and he's so dynamic, and he has such a variety of attacks. And Israel Adesanya has not faced a challenge like this just yet. The last time we seen Adesanya face adversity within the middleweight division was against Kelvin Gastelum. And the reason he faced adversity in that fight is because Kelvin Gastelum was not afraid to move forward and strike with Israel Adesanya and absorb some shots to land some shots. And that was an amazing fight. Gastelum hurt Adesanya multiple times. And I'm thinking, if Kelvin Gastelum, a short guy with a reach disadvantage, can close the distance on Adesanya and bust him up, what is an Alex Pereira going to be able to do? And I'm very interested to see how this fight plays out because, I know a lot of people are going to say, well, Adesanya is going to try to take Pereira down and out-grapple him. I don't really think that's an avenue to victory for Adesanya. I just don't think it's possible. I get it. Pereira might be able to be out-grappled by some of these guys like Vettori or, Robert Whittaker, or maybe a Yo Romero when he was back in the division. But I think Adesanya has very good defensive wrestling. I don't know if that's going to translate to offensive wrestling. And we've seen in the Michailidis fight, we've seen in the Bruno Silva fight with Alex Pereira, he has decent defensive wrestling. He was able to get up when he was taken down. He was able to defend well on the ground. I mean, I'm not saying he's some elite level guy on the ground, but I think he has what it takes to, even if Adesanya does decide to look for a takedown, I think Pereira will be able to defend them. And besides, I really don't think Adesanya is going to try to take him down. I think Adesanya is going to try to fight the same fight he always fights. And I think Pereira will not hesitate to pick him apart from range and try to win that way. And if he's not winning that way, we can see Alex Pereira move forward. And he's just such an elite level striker who'll go to the body repeatedly, then come upstairs. He mixes everything together very well. He's super dynamic. He's super, he's super selective in his shots. He's not wasting a lot of energy. And on top of that, when you look at Israel Adesanya's KO power, who's he finished? He's finished Robert Whittaker. He hurt Gastelum badly a couple times. But when it happens, it's guys overextending and Adesanya countering them when they're out of position. That's just not going to happen in the Pereira fight. I don't think Pereira has to be super worried about being KO'd by Israel Adesanya. So he can move forward, teeps to the body, left hooks, ripping hooks to the body as well. And I think Pereira can move forward. And as long as he's not overextending and leaving his chin exposed, he doesn't really have to worry about getting KO'd by Israel Adesanya. So it's going to be a very interesting dynamic. You're going to have Adesanya coming in more motivated than ever. You're going to have Pereira, who in his mind, he's like, I already got 2 wins over this guy. I'm going to win a third time. And both guys have evolved so much since those initial fights. And I cannot wait for this matchup. This is one of the biggest fights of the year. And this is my most anticipated fight outside of right now, as far as announced fights. Outside of Charles Oliveira versus Islam Makhachev, this is my second most anticipated fight. I cannot wait for Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira. As far as an early prediction for this fight, and this is a fight, when we get closer to the fight, I watch a lot of recent fight tape and then I make my prediction. But this is just an early prediction, so I may change my mind on this. But I am sticking with Alex Pereira by TKO. I just think Adesanya's kind of been coasting too much. And I believe Alex Pereira is one of these guys who can match him on the feet. And I believe he has 25 minutes to find that kill shot. And I know it's been a while since the Kelvin Gastelum fight, but if Kelvin Gastelum can find your chin and rock you, I think a crafty striker like Alex Pereira, who's super dynamic, very fast, he sets traps in the striking game as well. I really think he's going to be able to find the chin of Israel Adesanya, maybe second or third round, put Adesanya down and out, and then we probably would see a rematch in MMA. But I'm not 100%, solid on that prediction. I may change my mind. I got to watch some fight tape. But I think Pereira is he's such a tough matchup for Israel Adesanya. And I think this fight could be a little bit boring, okay? I think it's going to be exciting no matter what, but I think it could be a little bit boring because it's going to be kind of a chess match where both guys are trying to figure each other out. but the tension is going to be insane. And I think it's going to be super technical striking. And it might be just a little bit lackluster in action until it's not, until Pereira maybe finds that chin, rocks Adesanya, and goes after him, maybe gasses himself out. I could see a crazy fight as the fight goes on into the second or third round, and both guys start to get their reads on the feet and start landing shots. But I'm really looking forward to this. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Who do you think wins, Israel Adesanya or Alex Pereira? Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.